Thank you very much, Gergo. Thank you very much to the Hungarian Political Science Association for the invitation. For me, it's a real pleasure and an honor to be here with you. And I'm going to try to address a bit the problem that we are facing nowadays in Europe about the crisis of party systems, and give you at the end some provocative conclusions or recommendations on how I think that we could address it. But I would like to start this talk by asking you, do you think that last year, 2017, was a terrible year? I'm not talking about those who, for example, think that, well, it was terrible because Roger Moore died, Chuck Berry died, Jerry Lewis died. No, I'm talking about the fact that we had important earthquakes in a lot of Western European democracies. We got in the Netherlands, the Builders Party as main challenger of the government parties. We got almost, Marine Le Pen. She got a great chance to become, president of France. We had, for the first time since, the Second World War, a populist, far-right, let's call it better, party entering into the German parliament. And we also got the populist party in the Austrian government. But of course, 2017 was a paradise if we compare it with 2016, right? We had Brexit, we had the far left, in Spain, we had the famous, referendum in Italy, and of course, we got Donald, right, in the United States. Clearly, what we are seeing is a crisis of representative democracy. Democracy is being challenged. Democracy, in all its aspects, I use here the framework by Wolfgang Merkel, is being challenged by different phenomena. It's being challenged by the economic crisis, it's being challenged by the immigration, the Syrian crisis, of course, by Europeanization, the Euro crisis, and the globalization. These different phenomena have put democracy in danger in many of the elements of the notion. This has created anti-partisan feelings to the point that many, not only citizens but also scholars, talk about the need of democracy without parties, that we need experts, we don't need politicians. Trust in political parties is at the lower level. We have the European average at around 70%. We have, traditional democracies like France, Spain, Greece, Italy at very low levels. Hungary, yes, a bit over the European average, but it's incredible. Only 17% of citizens trust political parties. The truth is that some surveys even show that people believe more in life in Mars that they believe and trust political parties, And the problem is not only that the political parties are not trusted. The problem is that representative institutions, political parties included, are trusted much less than other institutions that are not representative, neither accountable. If you look at the Eurobarometer again, you see that the trust in the armed forces, the police, the judiciary, on average, is higher, much higher, than trust in representative institutions like parliament, the government, and of course, as usual, political parties at the end of the ranking. There is this idea that political parties are corrupt institutions, that they are only representing their interests, to the point that, as is shown by the Global Corruption Barometer of Transparency International, in 51 out of 107 countries surveyed, political parties are perceived among the institutions most affected by corruption. And by the way, Hungary is also one of them. So what we see here is clearly a crisis of political parties. Political parties are not connected to the people anymore. The level of party membership is at the lower level in history. We have countries like, for example, the UK, Hungary itself, France, not even 2% of the electorate belongs to political parties. The trend that we see since the 80s, according to the data that was compiled by Ingrid Van Biesen, Thomas Kounke, and Peter Mayer, shows a clear descending trend. I'm sure that if we were to run the same survey nowadays, both Spain and Greece, because this was basically before the crisis, would show also declining trends. But it's not only the problem that people do not even bother to have a party card or to become activists. The problem is also that they feel close less and less with political parties. You can see here the trends since the 50s in every single consolidated Western European democracy. The trend is towards less party identification. So it's not only that there are less members, we feel less close to political parties. But the problem is even more. We go to vote less and less. We see here the trends. This will be in the graphs that I will show you. The blue line basically is all Western European consolidated democracies in the 1920s. Later the red line goes to Southern Europe, and the green line is Eastern Europe. We see a declining trend in the levels of voter turnout. When we look at patterns and we look at those elections that have the record of abstention, we see here that in the last 16 years, 50% of the elections with the highest record of abstention took place, as I said, in the last 16 years. 50% of all the elections since 1920. But it's not only that people are not members, people are not identified with political parties, that they don't go to vote. The problem is that those who go to vote, they vote for different parties. They change the electoral preference from election to election. We see here Pedersen index of electoral volatility. The trend, especially since the end of the Second World War, has been increasing in Western Europe, Southern Europe. Of course, it decreased a bit in Eastern Europe. It was so high at the beginning of the 90s that it was, almost the only option. But it's still more than, 1/4 of the electorate on average in Eastern Europe change of electoral preference at the aggregate level. Measured at the aggregate level, from election to election. When we look at the patterns, we see that almost 40% of the elections with a record of high level of volatility concentrate only in the last 16 years. So we see clearly that there are different indicators that show the crisis of, party politics. But it's not only. They are not members, they are not activists, they don't identify, they don't go to vote. When they go to vote, they vote for different parties in every single election. There are also more parties in the system. The same trends that we see in relation to other indicators. But not only. When they go to vote and vote for different parties from one election to the next, they tend to vote for new parties. In the last, basically 5 decades, there has been an increase in 30 points of the percentage of votes for new parties. And what is, in my view, most worrying, and it's also the view of other scholars, they tend to vote for parties that are anti-establishment, that are anti-systemic, that are at the extremes of the political spectrum. This table looks at the percentage of support for anti-political establishment parties since basically the previous century, and you can see a clear trend, especially since the 60s, that tell us that anti-political establishment parties, and here I understand anti-political establishment parties following a Vedis concept, so those who challenge mainstream parties, those who assess that there is a divide between the establishment and the people, and those who also challenge some of the main, policy issues in the political system. Those are increasing their electoral success. We see at the average level, we see it also in terms of the patterns. 50% of the elections, with the higher percentage of vote for anti-establishment parties, have taken place in the last 16 years. What I wanted to show you here is that you can go to my website. This is where I have, the different classification of the anti-establishment parties and a lot of data that I will be showing here. So if you are interested in more specificities, please go there. We see it also in terms of regions. We see an increase in the level of support for anti-establishment parties. It is very interesting to see in Southern Europe how after the crisis, the level of support for this type of parties has increased. And we see it also in terms of the different countries. In the East, countries like Hungary, Czech Republic, Poland, Slovakia. Not in vain, in the last elections in Slovakia, for example, a neo-Nazi party got more than 80% of the votes. Here we don't have so much of a temporal trend, but we can see it clearly in the West. In all countries, with the exception basically of Malta and Switzerland, the percentage of votes for anti-establishment parties has increased over time. We have, of course, to take into consideration the fact that those affected by the immigration crisis, Austria, Germany, or by the economic crisis, think about Spain, Portugal, Greece, have those who have increased more the level of support for anti-establishment parties. It is also important to take into consideration that in some cases, when you look as far as the 1900s, there were other periods, France the same, where Italy in the 1994, where the level of support for these anti-establishment parties was high. But in general, as we saw on average, we see that anti-systemic, anti-establishment, extreme parties are getting more and more electoral support. Of course, this leads us to the question that many scholars have been asking: are anti-political establishment parties, populism, a menace for democracy? This is what Muller and others have been, praising in the last years, in the sense that populist parties, in the sense that the rise of support for anti-establishment parties put democracy in peril, to the point that we may, like in the 30s, have cases of democratic collapse. We look at this issue with Jose Rama from the Autonomous University in Madrid, and we look at basically all European democracies since the 1900s, and we see that effectively there is a correlation between the level of support for anti-political establishment parties and low quality democracy. We use Polity4 to measure the level of democracy. We also run different models, OLS, ELS, price regression, and we find that in all the models, polarization is significantly and negatively related to the quality of democracy. Interestingly enough, and coming back to the famous Sartorian hypothesis, fragmentation is also significant negatively related in all the models. For the sake of robustness, we also check with other different indexes. Here you see the data for another historical index, that is the varieties of democracy, the 5 elements of democracy, and we see that although if the negative relation is significant and more relevant in terms of electoral democracy than deliberative democracy, we see that the relationship is negative and significant with all the different dimensions of democracy. So 35 years later, we are able somehow to prove or to demonstrate the so-called Sartorian hypothesis, what Sani and Sartori were talking about, that when fragmentation, when it's coupled with polarization, leads to low quality democracy. cases like, typical cases like Weimar Republic, Czechoslovakia, Spain in the 30s, France in the 70s, Italy in the 90s, Latvia in the 90s, Poland in 1991, Belgium in the late 2010s. There are cases in point that clearly show that fragmentation coupled with polarization lead to very low quality democracy. So now that we more or less have equated that rise of anti-political establishment parties are bad for the quality of democracy, we should question what are the causes of the rise of the anti-political establishment parties. Well, some people say that it's economy, right? Economic voting theory, the fact that people that are feel worse off, they try to look for new alternatives. They try to, through the rascal south, they look both for the incumbents, and they look for, of course, those who show the simple solutions to complex problems, meaning anti-political establishment parties. Others look at institutions, specifically political parties. It's a realignment, theory of especially the European school that is was led by late Peter Mayer, and especially in Christopher Homo's book, Ruling the Void, right? Was this idea that parties have left the electoral arena, they have stopped mobilizing voters, there is a withdrawal of parties, there is a clear separation, never bigger, between voters and political parties, that can be seen in the fact that political parties have taken refuge in the state. They have felt protected by the amount of public subsidies. In Europe nowadays, with the exception of Switzerland, Malta, and Italy, since last year, all political parties receive important public subsidies from the state. Therefore, public subsidies are financially dependent from the state, and they don't need, like in the old times, to really recur, to their activists and supporters for financial support. They have also constitutionally and legally protected themselves by including, political parties in the constitutions, by also passing, party laws that protect them against, different challenges. To the point that, as Ingrid Van Biesing have said, political parties are not private institutions, are public utilities. And this is also the sense that voters perceive and lead to think of alternatives to democracy, the idea of liberal democracy. Others prefer to adopt a more sociological perspective, right? Is the realignment theory led by American scholars mostly, Russell Dalton. So the basic idea here is that the process of secularization, the decline of the working class and the class cleavage has led simply to voters to abandon their traditional links with traditional parties and to seek for representation in new alternatives. Some of them are populist parties at the extremes of the political spectrum. And of course, there are others that think that this is not so much about the economic development, it's the economic crisis. These are the scholars, like Hernandez, Crisi, that are talking about the fact, well, we have a huge economic crisis that has created an important impact in terms of cultural crisis, political crisis, and this is really why we see nowadays, after the Great Recession, the increase of support for anti-political establishment parties. Also with Jose Rama, we ran the same type of models I mentioned before, and what we see is very interesting. Same type of data since the 1900s. We see that economic factors are not significant, are not important at all. So meaning that the rise of support for anti-political establishment parties in Europe are not determined by economic factors, economic development. What is interesting is that both the alignment and the realignment theories, here we use the effective number of electoral parties as a proxy for the alignment and the electoral volatility, Pedersen index for a proxy for realignment, are significant in all the models. You can see it here. For every increase in the number of parties, there is also an increase in 3% of votes for anti-political establishment parties. For every increase in the level of volatility, 1 unit, it leads to an increase in almost 0.5% of votes for anti-establishment parties, pointing to the fact that it's not so much about the economy, but it's more about this process of the alignment, realignment that we were talking about. We also check for the economic crisis hypothesis. We basically, what we do is a comparison of the two major crises that Europe has ever faced, the Great Depression in the 1929 and the Great Recession in the 2008. And we see that while in 1929 there is not really effect of the crisis on the rise of votes for the political establishment parties, in the 2008 it is. So we try to see to what extent, what is that is going on behind this interaction. And what we see is that while in the Great Depression the number of parties are not significant, meaning that the same parties, the same traditional parties dominate the party system, and what simply happened was that voters exercised their right to accountability and chose between traditional parties, either opposition, either in government. In 2008, what is going on is that it is the crisis of traditional parties and not so much a process of realignment that is taking place. You see, the number of parties is significant, and moreover, when we look at the types of volatility, and we use here Teramonte and Emanueli's data, basically distinguishing between supply side volatility and demand side volatility. So it's a better proxy that allows us to say, well, it is about the voters, or the change to these new parties is because there are more parties in the system that are not traditional. We see that the second is the case, meaning that it's a problem of supply. It is a problem with traditional political parties. So basically, what we see is that anti-political establishment parties are a threat for democracy, as Muller and others have said, and what we see is that it's not about economy, as some have told us recently, but it is more about the crisis of traditional political parties. So in a way, and this links a bit with the work I'm doing now for this Oxford University Press book with Professor Njedi, it is a problem of the institutionalization of traditional parties. When we look at the levels of party institutionalization since 1848, what we see is a clear decline in the level of party institutionalization. Not only in general, but also and especially in continuous democracies. Somehow, pointing to the fact that we have seen the crisis of traditional political parties are the main cause, or one of the main causes, for the rise of populism and systemic and anti-political establishment parties. And this, of course, leads to the question that I have basically been studied for the last 5-7 years. If we need to find solutions to the problem of the crisis of traditional political parties, we also need to know the path, meaning how political parties, the institution of political parties, is connected with the consolidation of democracy. Because what we have seen, especially because of the literatures that were derived from Latin America, or especially from transitions in Southern Europe, it was this idea that it was the institutionalization of political parties that were leading to the consolidation of democracy. It was this idea that party institutionalization was a necessary but not sufficient condition for the consolidation of democracy. Others, however, conflated the concepts of party institutionalization and party system institutionalization. Gabor Toka, who is here, wrote an excellent piece in 1997 trying to look into this phenomenon in Eastern Europe. What is important, if we really want to understand where is the problem and how to tackle this problem, is to make this distinction and to understand that the institutionalization of political parties is a different phenomenon from the institutionalization of party systems. Understood, party system institutionalization as the process by which the patterns of inter-party competition become stable and predictable over time. They are different concepts. They have different dimensions. While party institutionalization basically has two dimensions, that is stable rules in society and a stable organization, party system institutionalization is more about stability in the structure of competition. Different authors have led to different dimensions, but the main agreement between the authors is that it's about the stability, right? And if there are different dimensions, we also need different indicators that allow us to measure these two phenomena that even if related, they are different, right? So in the book, when it's out, you have to all buy it. I will not go now to go into the details. We look basically at, or try to measure these two different dimensions, looking at what we call the electoral party dominance, that basically looks at the electoral success over time of political parties, stability in electoral success, but also at the age, the organization, so we use age as a proxy of stability of the organization. We combine them, the two, into a composite index that allow us to measure the two main dimensions of party institutionalization. Party system institutionalization, of course, we adopt the concept of closure of our mentor at the European University Institute, Peter Mayer, and we look at three different dimensions: government alternation, government formula, and access. If you are interested, please go to this article in Party Politics. We try to look into the different nuances of how to calculate the index. What is important is that in an article that I published in West European Politics last year, what I found is that, contrary to the common knowledge, the institutionalization of political parties per se are neither a necessary, not a sufficient condition for the consolidation, survival of democracy. There are countries where obviously democracy survived, despite the fact that they had, there were countries where democracy collapsed, like the case of the Weimar Republic or Austria during the interwar period, also the case of Turkey or Greece, despite the fact that they had very institutionalized political parties. There are cases also where democracy has survived, Poland, Georgia, despite the fact that political parties are very low institutionalized. You see it better here in this summary table. You see that basically there is no difference in the percentage of existence with institutionalized political parties among the democracies that collapsed and among the democracies that survived. What is the main message? The main message is that the institutionalization of parties is not directly related to the survival of democracy, contrary to what some people have thought. What is then political parties? Party institutionalization important? Well, party institutionalization is important, not only because it's related with the crisis of traditional parties that we are talking, and has led, as we saw, to the rise of anti-establishment parties. Also because there is a clear relationship between party institutionalization and party system institutionalization. So there is an indirect relation, as I will show in a minute, between the institutionalization of political parties and the survival of democracy. In fact, in that article that I mentioned, what I found is that it is the institutionalization of the party systems that is essential for the survival of democracy. And as I will mention, in 5 minutes, this has important implications on the way we try to perceive the solution for the problems we are facing nowadays. I challenge the traditional literature because, as I mentioned, the traditional literature mentioned that party institutionalization is a necessary but not sufficient condition for the survival of democracy. And what I found is that party system institutionalization is a sufficient condition and non-institutionalization is a necessary condition. So different from what all scholars have been thought until, very recently. In fact, this table groups all 48 European democracies since 1848. What you see is clearly that there have been, democracies that survive despite the fact that they have very low institutionalized party systems. So we cannot talk about, party institutionalization as a necessary condition. What we have, however, is cases with two exceptions where party system institutionalization clearly led to the survival of democracy. You can see here with this graph, you see that the probability of democratic failure is 3 times higher at a closure or institutionalization level of 70, so than 85. So meaning that the more institutionalized the party system, the less the probability that the democracy will collapse. And the other way around, when you have very low institutionalized party systems, democracies always collapse. Not always, sorry. In all the times where democracy collapsed, the party systems were not institutionalized. So meaning that under-institutionalization was a necessary condition for the collapse of democracy. This is a similar table, and you see clear the huge difference between those democracies where, or those countries where democracy survived and they had institutionalized party system, more than 50%, and those where, democracy collapsed but they had institutionalized party system. I mentioned these two exceptions, Greece and Turkey. Turkey basically was a brief party system of 40 years, so the real exception we can say is Turkey. And you can see how this importance of the party system has been changed, party institutionalization has changed. While basically until the late 70s, party system institutionalization was both a necessary and a sufficient condition. Since the 1970s, it has become, only sufficient. In any case, the important lesson to take out is that party system institutionalization is essential. So if party institutionalization is not essential, but is indirectly essential, what we see is a causal mechanism that leads from the institutionalization of parties, that help for the institutionalization of party system, and it itself help for the survival of democracy. And this has important, in my view, consequences, international. How we understand, for example, party aid, the money that has been spent in party aid, thinking that it was only the institutionalization of political parties that would lead to the survival of democracy. What this talk shows is that institutionalization of the party systems per se does not lead to the survival of democracy. What we need is political parties to help the institutionalization of the party system. Therefore, aid should be made conditional to that objective. And of course, has important consequences, in my view, at the national level. Right? Because if the rise of support for anti-political establishment parties is not an illness, as many scholars have said today, but simply the symptom, not the illness, but the symptom of the real illness, that is the crisis of traditional political parties, the solutions we may have for the illness would be different, right? If it's not anti-political establishment parties, those who are really ill, then, for example, making a surgery, extirpating the tumors, using bans, will not be effective. We have already used this in the past, right? We have, for example, used party bans in Germany, it worked. We have used party bans in Turkey, it didn't work. Another approach is to use chemotherapy, right? use the cordon sanitaire. It worked, think about Belgium, Czechoslovakia in the interwar period, but it didn't work in France. It hasn't worked in France, right? The cordon sanitaire. What I think, for all what has been told you in the last, 35 minutes, 40, I don't know, we need to change the diet of political parties. What I'm trying to say is that, we need traditional political parties to reform, right? It is not about tackling anti-political establishment parties per se. Because, as we saw, it is the crisis of traditional parties that led to the, increased support for anti-political establishment parties. We need parties that are strong, parties that are institutionalized. Nicole Bolliger has an excellent book on new parties in Western Europe, where she showed how institutionalized political parties, survive, in a high percent than those that are not. Margit Tavis applied the same, to Eastern Europe. We need parties that are responsive, parties that apply their programs, right? Parties that are responsible, parties that are transparent. Corruption has been considered to be also an important reason for the decline of traditional parties and the rise of anti-political establishment parties. We need parties that lead by their example. If a politician is corrupt, well, it should be, even if only temporarily, taken out, from politics. These things happen in sports, right? Cyclists, tennis players, when they are, considered to have used doping, they are temporarily suspended, right? Well, let's do it with politicians. Let's create this credibility that, voters are really looking nowadays in anti-political establishment parties. We need, of course, parties that lead to compromise. At the end of the day, we show that this party system institutionalization is the stability in the interactions between the different political parties that lead to the survival of democracy. And we, of course, need long-term compromises. We need politicians, parties that are not only thinking about the next election. One of the advantages of mass parties, and of course, great leaders in the past, was this. And of course, and especially in Eastern Europe, in my view, we need parties that do not consider democracy as a zero-sum game. This is essential if we really want, in my view, to regenerate, to create a new diet for traditional political parties that, as I showed, were one of the main causes for the rise of anti-political establishment parties. So in conclusion, anti-political establishment parties are a menace for democracy. We show it, different statistical models, the data set, different data sets, robustness checks. Why? Well, because traditional parties are ill. What I'm proposing here today, what I strongly believe through my study of party systems and political parties for the last 167 years, is that political parties are the problem, but political parties are the solution. They can fix the problem by regenerating and changing interiorly. Because, I'm finished here, as Scott Snyder said, 70 years ago, the rise of political parties is undoubtedly one of the principal distinguished marks of modern government. Political parties create a model, and that modern democracy is, I think we say, in terms of political parties. Thank you very much for your attention.